What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch and welcome back to the fifth and last episode of What is Total Warhammer? After having a closer look at magic, monsters and mighty heroes in the second episode, the world of Warhammer in the third episode, and what to expect from the battle gameplay and generally unit balancing in the fourth episode, in this here last episode we're going to talk about the differences you can expect from the campaign gameplay, and the ways in which it is going to be special and different from the other Total War titles. The races in Total Warhammer are not just visually different, they play completely differently. And this is not to say that in other Total War titles the factions all play exactly the same. They definitely don't. But it has never been as extreme as it is going to be in Total Warhammer, with each of the races in this game having their own little gameplay elements that the other races simply don't have. One huge difference right from the get-go to other Total War titles is that in Total Warhammer you cannot conquer the entire map. You can attack the entire map, but for example, if you are playing Empire, you cannot control Orc territory. You can attack Orc provinces and sack their cities, but you cannot occupy them. This does mean that single campaigns aren't going to be as open-ended and extremely long as some of the Total War campaigns can end up being. But at the same time, it still doesn't mean that the campaigns are going to be short. All of the playable empires actually start out pretty small, and there's a lot of diplomacy and upgrading and conquering that needs doing before you can call yourself victorious in a campaign. And even if the empire cannot conquer Orc or Dwarf territories, they still have an incredibly large chunk of the map that they can conquer, and an empire campaign can still potentially take hundreds of turns. The hordes have made a return from Attila. This was actually something I expected to happen in Total Warhammer since very early in its development, simply because the system fits so well. To quickly explain, usually in Total War titles when you lose your last settlement, that is it, you have lost. And if you take the last settlement of an enemy faction, that faction is destroyed. That is not the case in Total War Attila. When the last settlement of a faction is destroyed, that settlement's armies become hordes. These hordes are basically moving towns. They can settle down as a tent camp and can then produce units, replenish their units, gain some income for the faction and do basic city things before they then pack up their camp again and move along as armies. So far as we know, the system of hordes is available to Chaos and Orcs, but there is no confirmation that it will be available globally to the other factions as well. Orcs can have hordes. Chaos, on the other hand, is entirely a horde faction. So let's talk about Chaos. The Chaos faction in Total Warhammer does not conquer any territories. Instead, they sack or raze any settlement they encounter, but they can also do something called Awakening the Tribes, which turns the defeated province into an AI faction that is basically Chaos barbarians. They are in an immediate military alliance with the Chaos faction that liberated them, and will provide those Chaos forces with a sort of safe haven, an area where they get increased replenishment and defensive bonuses. So it kind of offers all the advantages of a conquered territory without actually having to manage any cities. Beyond that, Chaos champions can spread corruption. This will cause public disorder in the affected province, and if left unchecked will cause AI Chaos rebellions to happen. This lets you weaken provinces before you actually go there to conquer them. All in all, Chaos is an incredibly aggressive force. All in all, Chaos is an incredibly offensively minded faction that really wants you to be on the attack constantly. They will start off in the far north Chaos Wastes and will have the option of either conquering all the Norse tribes or immediately pushing into Kislev and southern territories. Now I will say that while there is released footage of the Greenskin tribes having horde armies running around the map, I don't know if this is an actual feature for all the Orc tribes or if it is just for AI controlled Orc tribes. The Greenskins start off in the southern Badlands, and most of their early campaign will be dealing with a lot of the other Greenskin tribes and some early scuffles with the Dwarves. It was shown in one of their live streams that the Orcs can actually make peace with the Dwarves, and I have to say that I am absolutely not a fan of this. Orcs do not accept peace with anyone. Orcs might be inclined to not attack Chaos while there are Dwarves to slaughter, but they would never ever make peace with Dwarves, because that is simply not what Greenskins do. Greenskins are all about the killing. And the Dwarves and human factions are the main target for the Greenskins in their campaign. All of your efforts will go towards conquering as much Dwarf territory as possible and eventually destroying the Empire. A big feature for the orcs is that all their armies have a fightiness meter. This fightiness scale is something that you will always have to keep an eye on for all your armies. Basically, when you are fighting battles and conquering territories, this meter increases, and if there are long periods of time where the army is just sitting around, then they are not generating this. You can, however, put the orcs into a raiding stance in enemy territory where they will generate income for your faction and also increase their own fightiness a little bit. When fightiness drops below a certain level, the army will start infighting because they simply have nothing to do, and they will suffer attrition as a direct result. This means that greenskins have to be very, very aggressive and have to actually fight a lot. This might not seem all that crazy in a Total War game, but it is actually significant because in all Total War games so far, while you definitely want to fight a lot, there are simply periods of time after you've conquered a lot of territory where you have to refill your armies and sit around for a while to make sure that you can actually keep all those territories. And if the orcs have to constantly keep fighting, then it is going to be harder for them to actually keep the territory that they conquer. The advantage of this is if they keep pushing their fightiness rating to a point where they enter a war, then you will actually have AI orc armies joining you and fighting with you. These armies will run behind your armies and attack things that you tell them to, until your fightiness rating drops below the war threshold and they lose interest. Now, the Empire campaign to me seems like it is the closest to a traditional Total War campaign. You still have your lords and legendary lords with all their own skill trees, and all the other cool stuff that's brand new with Total Warhammer, but in general of how the campaign is going to work out with a lot of diplomacy with the other Empire provinces and fighting the vampires and the greenskins and the chaos, it does seem very similar to how Total War games just work in general. But at the same time, I think it's going to be a nice challenge to play the Empire in Total Warhammer, because with all the other crazy races around you doing crazy things, playing a pretty standard Total War faction is actually going to be quite the challenge. Because there's going to be huge wargs coming from the south, the chaos forces coming from the north, vampires on both sides corrupting the ground, and quickly raising a ton of undead. That seems to me that the Empire is going to rely very, very heavily on a really good economy, and on maintaining very good relations with the Dwarves and the other Empire provinces. Which is being pretty true to the IP, so I have absolutely no problem with that. Now, we don't know all that much yet about how the vampires are going to be super different from the other factions. What we do know is that they heavily rely on corruption. So when the vampires spread from province to province, they slowly corrupt the area and turn it into sort of an spooky undead land. But this also means that it's going to slow down the advance of the vampires, because when vampires and their armies reside in areas that aren't corrupted, they take attrition as if the entire map was winter in any other Total War game. So that's also going to be very interesting, because in other Total War games, you usually have periods where you build up huge armies and then conquer a whole bunch of territory and then sit on that territory until you have all of it under control, deal with other stuff. But with the vampires, it seems you will have to gradually conquer the surrounding territory and not have these periods of huge expansion and then periods of doing nothing. It will be a lot more gradual, which is fascinating to me because I've never played a Total War game like that. The vampires also start out completely surrounded by enemies. Empire, Kislev, and dwarves in their back. It's not going to be the easiest of times for the vampires in the beginning stages of the campaign. But being an army of undead, they have of course one really cool feature, and that is Raise Dead. And this feature is kind of similar to the mercenary system from Rome 2 and Attila, where recruiting units generally takes a turn, but mercenary units can be bought immediately and be available the actual current turn, but they cost a ton more upkeep than regular troops would. For the vampires, this is actually a little bit different, because their Raise Dead ability does give them the troops immediately on this turn, which allows them to do some crazy things, but they are the same unit, so they are not actually more expensive in upkeep. However, they only have access to Raise Dead if there are dead people there. So every time a battle is being fought, you will have a marker on the map that will signify that there are a bunch of corpses there because a battle was fought. And the larger the battle was, the more access you will have to Raise Dead, and the more access you will have to higher level troops from Raise Dead. This is probably also what's going to help you survive the early game, because if you get invaded a bunch by Empire and the Dwarves, You will fight battles, and that will give the option to raise dead to strike back and have more power than they do if you went out sort of even. And then lastly we have the Dwarves, who are actually the most widespread race of them all, but you still start with only a few provinces in the World's Edge Mountains. All the other dwarf tribes you can of course befriend and form alliances with rather easily, and you should, because it's of course going to make you a lot safer against the greenskin incursions that are inevitably going to happen. The good thing about the dwarves is that they have a very powerful defensive positions. Being set in the mountains, there are not that many ways you can generally approach their fortresses from, which lets the dwarves do some really nice bottlenecking. The tech tree of the dwarves looks probably the most like a traditional Total War tech tree out of all the others. You have two major branches in your tech tree, one assigned to the guilds and one assigned to the clans. The guilds focus more on economy and building up your cities and giving buffs to all of your city buildings, and the clans focus more on military, giving you buffs for all your troops, unlocking new troops, and making your troops more efficient. Beyond that, the dwarves also have a very cool system in grudges. This means every time another faction does something bad to you, like conquer one of your provinces, destroy one of your armies, or even just sack one of your settlements, you'll be issued a grudge, and you can think of them like retaliatory mini-quests. It will generally be directed against a settlement of the enemy or an army of the enemy, and by crushing them you will be paid out a bunch of money. I'm a huge fan of this feature because not only is it incredibly dwarfish to have grudges, but it is also going to give you a really nice incentive to specifically go after certain enemy positions or armies to gain a bunch of extra cash. Now all of the factions of course also have their legendary lords, and those legendary lords have quest lines. Those epic quest lines will lead you across the map and have you fight a bunch of specific scripted quest battles that will, if you win them, reward you with a bunch of magic items, new mounts, or any some such. Karl Franz, for example, is actually going to have to do a bunch of his questline before he's allowed to ride on Deathclaw. So there's a whole lot of gameplay in that, as every faction has two legendary lords. And that is pretty much everything we know so far about Total Warhammer. I'm sure we will be able to see for ourselves because the game will come out in just under a week. I will of course be jumping headlong into the game and try to give you a review of it as soon as possible after the launch. I did not get a review copy, so I'm just going to have to wait for that launch copy and then play as much as I can in 2 days and review the game. I will also do playthroughs of different races, but they will not be basic Let's Plays. They will be very similar to the format of Slaves to No One, a show that will start this week. So if you're interested in Total Warhammer, keep an eye on my channel this week for Slaves to No One, because that will give you an idea of how I'm going to structure the content for Total Warhammer as well. In the top right there is a poll that you can vote in to tell me which of the factions I should play first. Thanks very much for watching this series on what is Total Warhammer. I hope you learned a little bit about the Warhammer world, and let's hope the game turns out just as good as it looks. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video.